Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of YouTube video with me, your host, Man. And man, am I excited, because it's time for Japan-only PlayStation games Volume 15, the connoisseur's choice for cool old games from Japan and lousy Godzilla jokes. Fan selection rules are still in effect, which means we've got 4 juicy picks courtesy of this show's lovely viewers, all chosen via everybody's favourite circular purveyor of random chance, Send Your Wheel. And my god, has it picked some very interesting games for us today, so let's cut the banter and get straight into it. You're here for the games, and let me tell you, the wheel is providing.
You will provide.
Kicking things off today, we have the cute stylings of Poppin' Tanks, a 1999 release from developers Symbio Systems and everybody's favourite squareless friend, Enix. This game was chosen for us today by 3 lovely people, them being Clear Mountain, Ryuma King and Sean A, not to be confused with A. Sean, of which I am one of many. Now, during my time making these videos, I've been quite lucky to play a number of rather fun tank-based games, as well as some cute chibi vehicular games, and I've also had the joy of playing quite a lot of 1v1 arena battlers, but often I thought to myself, what would happen if we combined all these things, but also added some sick anime cutscenes? Well, Poppin' Tanks is the result, a very cute 1v1 arena battler with tons of personality. It really feels like the illegitimate baby of Virtualon and Chorokyu, well, the military-based spin-offs of Chorokyu anyway. Shout out to all the Seek and Destroy fans out there. Best 50p I've ever spent. But does Poppin' Tanks offer up anything unique in the crowded arena battle sphere, other than being very cute? Well, let's find out. Now, there's a few different modes in Poppin' Tanks, but we might as well start with the story mode, which is our basic arcade mode equivalent in this game. You'll choose from one of 8 different drivers and their accompanying tanks, and take on a bunch of other tanks one by one until you reach the credits.
Lovely stuff.
Now, as usual, a lot of the basics that you'd expect from a 1v1 fighting game are here. The battles are split into a best of 3 contest where you and your opponent gotta blast each other with weapons and abilities until one of you is left standing or the time runs out. Nothing unusual there. But as for the gameplay, yeah, this is very reminiscent of Virtualon or what we saw in earlier volumes from games like Project Gaia Ray and Cosmo Warrior Zero, where the game is played with the camera focused on your opponent, and this means that your movement, aiming and navigation around these arenas are a little bit unusual because of this. You use the D-pad to move back and forward, as well as turn left and right, and you can even do a little dash by double tapping forward, which is low-key a pro move in this game. But since the camera is always locked to your opponent, it can take a little while to get this game's movement down, but once you do, it feels really good in action, which is no doubt enhanced by some rather convincing physics and weight to your tanks, not to mention some stellar animations which make the act of moving around in this game a complete joy. I mean, if you like drifting and doing donuts but in a tank, I legit think no game does it better than this one. As for actually aiming at your opponent, this is also pretty good too. The game uses a very simple lock-on system that kicks in whenever your turret is facing your opponent. Now the key word here is turret, because in most arena battlers, there's usually movement options that allow you to automatically face and lock onto your opponent, and would you believe it, Poppin' Tanks lets you do this too, and it's as good as ever. But the crucial thing that sets this game apart combat-wise for me is the ability to rotate your tank's turret 90 degrees to the left and right using the L1 and R1 buttons. This means that you can effectively circle strafe around your opponents, all while shooting them up. Now you may think that the lock-on makes this quite easy to do, but it's really more of a visual indicator to let you know that you're in firing range of your opponent, and the act of aiming more so comes down to careful movement and positioning of your tank, as well as predicting your enemy's movements. It's another thing that takes a little while to get down, but the synergy of moving and aiming is very satisfying when you get good at it, and it's probably the main thing gameplay-wise that really sets Poppin' Tanks apart from other titles in the genre. Now once you've got the movement and aiming down, the next part is actually damaging your opponent, which is thankfully pretty self-explanatory. Each tank has 4 different ways of draining your opponent's life bar. You've got your standard cannon rounds, which vary depending on the tank that you choose. This will be your main source of damage in-game, and while you do have infinite ammo, your cannons have cooldown timers and slowly reload bullets, so you can't just spam shots willy-nilly. Some cannons are built for long range, others for AoE damage, and some are just straight up shotguns, so suffice it to say, there's a cannon out there for everybody. But beyond that, the other best way to deal damage is with your tank's special weapons. These are very powerful abilities that can quickly change the course of battle. You only get 2 of these per round, and they can range from missile barrages, giant bombs that chase you around the arena, death lasers, even dropping snowmen on people. You name it, it's got it. Now there's always a big risk-reward factor when using these things, since there is a slight charge before unleashing them, and this can be very easily interrupted by an opponent, which will leave you wide open for retaliation. But then again, if you get one of these things off on an opponent who's slacking, it's basically a free win. Now cannon shots and special attacks are your prime damage sources in game, but you've also got 2 other abilities that can come in quite handy. The first of which is your tank's unique attack. These are close range abilities that usually involve your tank either dashing into opponents or simply just jumping on them. Depending on the tank, these can be quite powerful or quite terrible. Seriously, the jump attack is atrocious compared to having a tank that just goes on fire and runs right into you, but they're another way to help close the gap between you and your opponent, and more importantly, it gives you another way to catch them off guard if they're charging up an attack. And finally, last and most certainly least, the only ability that's shared across all of the tanks is a basic machine gun that can be fired at will with practically no cooldown. This weapon is very much a last resort when all your other abilities are on cooldown, as it does negligible damage to your opponents, but crucially, it can be used to interrupt opponents in a pinch and also damage structures in the environment, so it does have some strategic value, even if it seems relatively weak on the surface. Anyway, as you can see, there are a lot of options between the 8 tanks available, and naturally each of these has strengths and weaknesses in different areas, not just in their weapons and loadouts, but in areas like speed, power, and armor as well. And if you factor in the game's many different battle arenas full of different elevations, structures, and destructible elements, it means that there's a lot of fun dynamic additions that can further change your strategy from fight to fight. Some of these levels even have health and special weapon items that drop from destroyed structures, so it always pays to be aggressive, reactionary, and on the move. Now, the story mode in Poppin' Tanks is a great way to get you used to the gameplay and different tanks, but beyond that, it also spends a lot of time giving you a fun little story for each of the characters. You get a lovely little anime cutscene when you kick things off, and between each battle, there's plenty of story sequences between the characters, and you even get to travel around a cute little map screen, which is always appreciated. Story mode always ends with the same battle, which is a pretty easy but cool boss fight against this giant boat tank, which also gets its own cutscene intro by the way, which is amazing. Sadly, you can't play as this guy for obvious reasons, but it sure is fun to blow up. Now, if you're expecting the usual fighting game system of beat story mode to unlock a new character and then do it again, etc., that's not really what you're gonna get here. Outside of the cool cutscenes and story, of course, you don't really unlock or get anything extra for completing story mode in this game, so what's here to keep you sticking around? Well, good news everybody, we're yet to talk about the main single player content of this game called Tank World, and let me tell you, it's pretty great. Tank World sees you select from any of the game's 8 base tanks, and then enter into a tank league of sorts where you have to fight battle after battle in pursuit of the all-important number 1 rank, but better still, this mode also allows you to customize and rename your tank as well as kit it out with new parts and accessories, effectively allowing you to build your cute little dream tank. There's quite a large number of parts to get as well, roughly 300 in total, so even though you're gaining new items after every single battle you win, it's still going to take you quite a long time to earn all the parts in this mode, and not only that, each part is specific to the tank that you select, so if you want to truly 100% this game, you'd need to start a new Tank World save with each of the 8 tanks and then work your way to the top, and believe me, that'll take you quite a long time to do. Now there are some limitations to the customization. For example, you can change your turret and special weapons no problem, but your unique tank skill is always locked depending on what tank you choose at the beginning. So in other words, picking the tank with the best turret and special ability but that stupid jump attack was actually quite a bad choice in the long term. Also visually, you're limited to the treads that come with your tank, and while you can adjust the colors, there's always one color that is locked to your initial tank choice, so do keep that in mind too. Overall, Tank World is a great addition to the game and effectively gives you an infinitely replayable single player mode with lots of unlockables and things to work towards. This mode is also the only place where you can unlock the game's additional arenas, bringing the in-game total up to 15 to select from, which is really quite generous for a game of this type. And best of all, as you can imagine, the game does have standard 2-player battles using split screen, but there's also a custom battle mode that lets you and a friend face off using your save files from Tank World, which I think is the ideal endgame for this thing. Sure, it's got a lot of single player content, but this is very much a game that will shine best in multiplayer with 2 equally matched opponents. The potential for silly battles and mechanical outplays is very, very high, and we love to see it. That being said though, while there's certainly a lot to love here, I did have a few minor issues with the game overall, and it doesn't really have anything much to do with gameplay, more so just how easy and unbalanced it all is. I think of the many battles I had in this game, I only really lost 1 or 2 rounds while I was still learning how to play. Otherwise, the game's AI never really puts up much of a challenge, and while I did have some fun and dynamic battles throughout my playtime, a lot of it felt like I was on autopilot to an extent, and considering the main single player mode is literally hundreds of battles one after another, it can very easily get repetitive quite quickly. Now, the new weapons and items that you can unlock might help mix that up, but the majority are just simple stat buffs that have no visual effect on your tank or weapons, and out of the many special weapons and turrets that you do unlock, it feels like there are quite a lot of duds, and a select very few overpowered weapons that you'd be crazy not to use given the choice. Now this, along with some other issues like lengthy load times, kind of made Tank World drag after a few hours, and it's not really anything to do with the gameplay itself, which I think is wonderful. I just think a few extra tweaks and refinements to the customization and weapon balance alongside something like a difficulty toggle for AI would make it something that I could easily play forever, but otherwise I think the lack of challenge just burnt me out after a few hours of play. There's also the language barrier as well, which thankfully is another case where the game is easily playable without any knowledge of Japanese, thanks to some very clear and simple menus, as well as some handy online guides that are out there. But considering the wealth of story segments and these cool little additions in Tank World, like the newspaper articles and special missions, you still feel like you're missing out on quite a lot. It's one of those games that you can play without a translation, but you'd also still really appreciate one because the game and its characters are bursting with personality, and it feels like a shame not to really get to know them. And speaking of personality, even with the great gameplay, it's the presentation and poppin' tanks that really wins you over while playing this thing. The vehicle designs are varied, interesting and colourful. I mean, you've got cute little tanks, a pig car, souffle tanks, and even something that looks like it could have won Series 2 of Robot Wars, the peak of design. The characters are also amazing. I know very little about them other than their opening cutscenes, but the game pretty much sells you on them all within a couple of seconds. The characters were all designed by Mini Yoshizaki, who's probably probably most notable for his work on Sergeant Frog, which actually makes a lot of sense really. Also, he named this character Gunt, and I think even saying that out loud might get this video demonetized. I mean, if we move a few pixels here, we're moving into dangerous territory. And this isn't even the only Gunt in video gaming. They have Gunt in Winback too. Clearly, Guntamania was running wild in Japan at the time. The presentation in the battles are also excellent too. Lots of cool visual effects on the weapons and bullets, tons of visual variety across the various arenas, and you even get to fight on the moon, a surprisingly common occurrence in PS1 tank games. The game's got a decent frame rate that mostly sticks at 30 FPS, even in multiplayer, and once again the animations on the tanks, especially combined with the feel of the control and movement, mwah, chef's kiss. The sound, unfortunately, was kind of a mixed bag. The sound effects are decent and what you'd expect from a chibi tank game, and I guess I could say the same for the music too. There's a handful of really good up-tempo and guitar-driven tracks here, but the majority of the soundtrack is light-hearted, playful, and kind of has a childish vibe to it, I guess you could say. It certainly fits the aesthetic of the game, and while none of it is bad, I wouldn't really say it's my style of music personally, but the few tracks that do stand out, they're pretty damn good, let me tell you. Anyway, that's Poppin' Tanks in a nutshell, one of the cutest games I've played in this series, and also maybe the best arena battler too. The gameplay at its core is a more simplified version of what we've seen in the many virtual on-likes that we've played, but the vehicular movement and turret aiming make it feel like nothing else in the genre, and when you get good at it, there really is a lot of room for mechanical outplays and some very interesting and dynamic battles. Unfortunately though, while the single player content is very plentiful with lots of things to unlock, the lacking customization and lacking difficulty when playing against the AI does run the risk of fatiguing you on the game a little quicker than it probably would like. That being said though, if you have a friend or a small community to play this game with, that's 100% where it should shine the brightest, and I think even with my issues, the core gameplay should be celebrated because despite its cute vibe and presentation, there's a mean and satisfying little tank game beneath it all, and if you like arena fighters, vehicular combat games, sweet anime cutscenes, or even just serving Gunt on occasion, well, Poppin' Tanks is a game you definitely shouldn't sleep on.
You will provide.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Crisis City, a 1998 release from Takara and Vistech, not to be confused with the Sonic level called Crisis City or the PS2 game called City Crisis, which is pretty fun. This game was chosen for us today by now two-time winner Gabriel Lucas, and let me tell you, this might just be the dumbest video game I have ever played, and I mean that in a good way. Crisis City, as the box describes it, is a new type gun action duel game, which basically means it's an arcade style run and gun that's also a 1v1 fighter involving guns, that's also full of pre-rendered backgrounds and is absolutely unhinged. An enticing combination for sure, but is it actually any fun to play? Well, let's find out. So we might as well start with the main single player mode, where you choose from one of 7 playable characters and then take on 7 different stages that are split into 2 different sections. There's these run and gun action parts where you move from screen to screen, shooting and rolling to your heart's content, and then at the end you have a little 1v1 boss fight where you face off against one of the other playable characters in a gun duel to the death, where you can also roll and shoot to your heart's content, or get hit by cars, or just outright explode. Now I suppose the big thing that affects the gameplay here is the decision to use pre-rendered backgrounds, something that's usually associated with slower paced genres like role-playing games or horror titles, but Crisis City is straight up fast-paced arcade action, just with weird forced perspectives and tiny characters, which honestly is a kind of ballsy choice for a game of this type, and unsurprisingly, for as cool as it often is visually, it comes with a lot of issues gameplay wise, but we'll cover them as we go. For now, let's focus on how to actually play the game, which thankfully is quite straightforward, since it's mostly just running and gunning. There's no tank controls here, so the D-pad's just gonna send you running in whatever direction you point it in, although there are buttons you can hold to walk and strafe, turn a little to the left or right, and even crouch, which is useful for shooting lower objects, and also avoiding roughly 99% of the bullets in this game. Or if you prefer, you can also tap the circle button for a handy dodge roll, which, as it's a video game, makes you immune to all forms of damage. As for the fun part, shooting stuff, each character has a standard projectile weapon that is unique to them, and this is your primary source of damage in game. And while each weapon does have unlimited ammo, they also have different clip sizes and reload times, which can heavily affect the gameplay from character to character. Something shared between all of them though is a stock of 30 grenades that you can chuck out by pressing the triangle button, handy for taking out groups of enemies or particularly spongy enemies, and since these restock after each level, you might as well chuck a few, even if just for fun. Now the only thing we're yet to mention is the most important function, locking on to enemies, because while you can try to manually aim in this game, it is almost impossible and not recommended in the slightest. Now your lock on isn't performed by holding down a button, rather you toggle lock-on mode on and off by simply tapping the X button, and from there, your character just tends to lock onto whatever enemies are in their range and direction. Now this lock is a little bit finicky, and there's no way to manually switch it from whatever enemy you're targeting other than by just pointing your character in that direction, but in general it works well enough. It seems to have the best accuracy when used in conjunction with the strafe ability, which I guess makes sense since your character is slowing down and focusing on their aim, but all you really need to know to succeed at Crisis City is just to turn lock-on mode on and then shoot at everything and never ever stop moving, and maybe, just maybe, you might succeed or explode into a blaze of glory. It's really a 50-50 chance either way. Anyway, next up we'll look at the 7 different characters, which, as mentioned before, do heavily affect the gameplay, since not only do the level orders change depending on who you pick, but we also have different weapons, different armor, and different speed values per character. Each character has their own difficulty rating that goes from C to A. What does this mean? I really can't tell you, as some of the C-rated characters are either the easiest or hardest characters to play as, and all those A's and B's are wildly inconsistent as well. So, in other words, don't worry about it. As for the characters, we have Ralph, who is the Mario of this game, with basic stats, a simple high ammo pistol, and is a great beginner choice to learn the ropes. Next up we have Pamela, who is kind of like Ralph if he was a woman, and had a machine gun. So in other words, a better Ralph. After that we have Alicia, who is the first of our fast characters, which means they move a whole lot quicker, but also die a whole lot quicker. Alicia also has a pistol, but I think it's a little bit weaker than Ralph's, at least going by how long it takes to blow up a gas tanker, which is a lot longer than it really should be. Now the other fast character is Ewan, another guy with a pistol, but this guy is a little bit stronger but also a little bit slower than Alicia, although honestly he's still pretty fast and also does take a long time to blow up the tanker, so who even knows really? Next up, we've got our duo of slow, tanky characters, aka the worst characters, because this is really not the game to be slow in. First up is Christy, the only character in the game to use a shotgun, which both looks and sounds pretty cool on paper, but since the game swarms you with enemies at times and you've only got one shot before needing to reload, it means you've got to spend way more time dodging bullets with Christy, and since dodge rolling also interrupts your reload animation, and it's a long reload animation too, well, Christy is not great. Also not great is Jared, a big military dude with a big gun to match. This shoots 10 big rounds, which in fairness do loads of damage, but the bullets are very slow, too slow even for some fights. Throw in another long reload time, and well yeah, between Jared and Christy, these are clearly the choices for people looking for a challenge. On the other hand though, if you're looking to avoid all semblance of challenge and just want to have a grand old time, may I introduce you to our 7th character, Ruth. Odd name for a guy, but he more than makes up for it by having a big sniper rifle that behaves just like a pistol, only it also does incredible amounts of damage to literally everything. Seriously, it's almost comical how quickly you can end boss fights with this guy. I mean, sure, it also could be because your opponent got hit by a car or 6, but I'm sure the bullets also contribute a fair amount too. So as you can see, the 7 playable characters each offer their own little spins to the gameplay, and while there's not a huge amount of diversity in their weapons and abilities, it's nice to have a decent selection to play around with, especially considering how short this game is. A single playthrough of Crisis City should take you anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes on average, with the run and gun sections taking up most of the levels, and then the boss fights usually lasting about 10 to 20 seconds if you're lucky. Now this will take you a fair bit longer if you die, and since there's no health or item pickups in this game and you can also just die at literally any moment because of reasons, you'll probably end up seeing this screen a lot. There's no lives in this game, just continues really, and if you die in a level, you simply just have to start it again from the beginning, but if you manage to make it to the boss and then die, you will start from there. Continues are unlimited luckily, so it's no pressure if you do die. The only penalty is that it resets your score upon death, which is either the worst or best punishment depending on how much you care about big numbers next to your initials, which I know a lot of you do. Now beyond the standard single player mode, you can also fight a friend or a computer in 1v1 duels, or try your hand at time attack mode, which to be honest I feel is really well suited for this game. I mean, I'm no speedrunner, but this game sure is fun to beat quickly, let me tell you. And yeah, that's the gameplay of Crisis City in a nutshell. It's fun enough, I guess. I can't really say it's a particularly good video game, mostly down to some awkward movement and navigation related to the pre-rendered backgrounds and camera angles, and also the lock-on system that kind of works but never consistently enough to make you feel like you can really rely on it in a pinch. There's also a complete lack of balance thanks to ducking kind of breaking the game for some characters, as well as some enemies and objects taking a ludicrous amount of bullets to put away, and sometimes even grenades. I mean, I'm talking hundreds of bullets and about 20 grenades here. It is insane. Unless you're playing as Ruth, of course, in which case balance is but a mere concept. And I suppose when it comes to the later non-playable bosses in the final 2 levels, these guys move so fast, it feels like they actually weren't designed with some of the slower weapons in mind, making the act of even just grazing these guys with a bullet a task made for a god. The whole thing is, quite frankly, all over the place. When it's good, it's good. When it's bad, it almost feels like it's trolling you, but it's also one of those rare cases where a game manages to rise above its issues in the name of one thing, and that's being really fucking funny. Crisis City on a gameplay level is fine, but nothing special. Crisis City on a spectacle level, there's really nothing else like it. Never has a game been this frantic, this unhinged, this content with killing you in the funniest way possible. A game full of explosions just for the sake of having explosions, inanimate objects suddenly animating and going right for you, and a game with so many vehicles recklessly driving at you, it would make Frogger nervous. This game relishes in overwhelming you and threatening you with death and insanity around almost every corner. A game designed to be stupid and over the top, simply for the joy of being stupid and over the top. Who needs logic and well-balanced gameplay when the act of dying is part of the fun? And best of all, when you beat the game for the first time, you unlock a new extra mode, which is a remix arrange mode of the main game, but with more enemies and new layouts, only this time around, They didn't even hide how silly they wanted this game to be, replacing cars with humans, explosions with humans, just adding weird little guys wherever they wanted really. They even spawn so many enemies into a room at one point that it almost makes your PlayStation overheat under the strain. Why? I'm not quite sure, but it is funny. Now, despite the insanity, the game has a surprising amount of story too, with text-heavy cutscenes before each level and boss, and most of this dialogue is voiced too. I believe the guy who voices Ralph in this game is also the Japanese voice actor for Sonic the Hedgehog, so it's not just the name Crisis City that these games both have in common.
それが何だというのだ。あいつらなら心配ないだろう。
Now, as for the plot of this thing, I'll be honest with you. I have no idea what is going on in this game. I mean, yeah, unsurprisingly, the story is all in Japanese and is really the only Japanese in this game, by the way, but between the cool art during the cutscenes and the intensity of the voice acting, it sounds at least like they're taking the story in this game pretty seriously, and there's just something about the silliness of the gameplay juxtaposed with these voice actors giving it their all that somehow made the game even funnier to me. I mean, I purposely didn't translate this stuff because I wanted to imagine this dark, serious story in my head, and then the next minute you're moving into like an apartment complex and you're rolling around having a big gunfight while people are just trying to leave their apartments for work, you know? Now, since the style of gameplay is very arcadey, the story is easily skippable, but if a fan translation for this thing ever pops up, I promise you, I'll be all over the lore for this game. Some of these opening pictures for the characters in story mode go so damn hard, it's a little bit tough not to be intrigued. Speaking of the game's presentation, Crisis City is a mixture of very good and very meh. The vision there for its world and characters is on point, giving us this cool near-future sci-fi feel, but the models are quite small and lacking in detail, and the enemy variety is also pretty low, and I suppose the pre-rendered backgrounds, while nice and visually interesting for the most part, aren't the cleanest around, and most of the really nice screens that you will see you'll be looking at for about 2 or 3 seconds before moving on to a new one, and it's kind of an area where the blistering pace of the game hurts it in a way. You don't really get much time to take anything in, since if you look away for a second, well, something bad's probably going to happen to you. The sound, on the other hand, if you like loud noises and high-tempo electronic music, you are in for a good time. I wouldn't say the music is a particular standout here, since it's kind of hard to outshine the insanity of the gameplay itself, but they at least picked great music to complement the insanity, which is all you could ever really hope for. Well, that's about it for Crisis City, one of the dumbest and funniest games that I've ever played. As an arcadey action game, yeah, it's pretty fun. It's also horribly unbalanced, really short and kinda janky, but it just has so much bravado and confidence in what it's doing that you can't help but love it. It's a game that I would never recommend for the gameplay, but one that I kinda think everybody needs to experience firsthand, because the idea of a retail game like this existing at all is kind of incredible in and of itself. A game that throws good design out the window because making a bunch of cars crash into you from off screen is simply the funnier option, and when given the choice, it's a game that will always pick the funny option each and every time. And I love that about it. Look, I've played plenty of great games, your 5-star classics, your design masterclasses, but I have never in my life played something as unhinged as this little game, and it's rare these days to find something in a sea of games that is truly unique and one of a kind, and I promise you, you won't play or experience anything else like Crisis City. Truly the dumbest action game of them all, and it's damn proud of it too.
You will provide.
Next up, we have Battle Arena Nitoshinden, which made its way to the PlayStation in September of the year 1996. This game was chosen for us today by the lovely SN Kierstead over on Patreon, and it gives us a good opportunity to talk about one of the PlayStation's most important series, Battle Arena Toshinden, of course. Now, those familiar with Toshinden are probably of the same mindset as me, where it's a series that I quite enjoy, but will happily admit it's not very good. But despite that, Toshinden had a really important role to play in the history of the console, as the original Toshinden was one of the big launch titles across every major region. And we gotta remember, back in 94 and 95, the big head-to-head between the Saturn and the PlayStation was really more of a battle between Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter versus Ridge Racer and Toshinden, as these were the games that were meant to sell you on the 3D capabilities of the console, and nothing did that better at the time than racing and fighting games. Now, here in the future, the idea of comparing Virtua Fighter and Toshinden is quite silly, but back in 95, don't forget, Virtua Fighter had a pretty rocky Saturn port that didn't do the console any favors, while Toshinden was coming out swinging with crazy new features like texture map characters and arenas, Redbook CD quality audio. Not to mention, Toshinden was also the first 3D fighter to include weapons and special moves in a 3D space, and more notably, a sidestep option, with the marketing being heavily skewed towards calling this the first true 3-dimensional fighter, something that's quite funny to think about in retrospect, but considering the frivolous things that console fanboys argue over nowadays, I've no doubt somebody was talking up Toshinden in the playground because you could roll in and out of the screen. Now, was Toshinden any good? For the time, yeah. It certainly hasn't aged very well, but it was a case of a game coming at the exact right time it needed to. In other words, it appeared a couple of months before Tekken, and as such, it's kind of synonymous with the PlayStation and its launch. I mean, if you boot up Demo 1, the very first game you see is Battle Arena Toshinden, so Sony was clearly riding high on this bad boy. Of course, by the time that Tekken rolled around, Toshinden began taking a backseat to the new king of fighting games on the platform. I mean, Namco even took away their claim to fame as the premier weapons-based 3D fighter, because if there's one thing Namco likes doing, it's taking somebody's idea and then doing it better than them. So Toshinden only really had a brief moment in the sun, but even still it had a pretty healthy life cycle on the PlayStation with multiple entries and spin-offs making it to the console. A year after the original Toshinden, we got Battle Arena Toshinden 2, which is more or less Toshinden 1 again, but with improved controls and visuals, you know, the standard fighting game update of the time. Toshinden 3, however, changed things up with a revamped combat system and also a change in arena style, moving from open combat arenas with ringouts to this walled-in system that allows you to combo and interact with the arena walls. Some people love or hate this change, but personally I think it's the best playing of all the Toshinden games on the console, plus it also has a dude with a chainsaw, and is the only one that has a toggle in-game that allows you to swap between 30 and 60 FPS gameplay, and let me tell you, Toshinden at 60 frames per second, it's like a whole new game. And then we have the final mainline entry in the series, Toshinden 4, which is also the only one not to see a release in North America, which is why I'm playing the PAL version here, and my god, going from 60 FPS Toshinden 3 to 25 FPS Toshinden 4 is quite strong whiplash, let me tell you. Now don't worry, from here on out we will be showing the superior 30 FPS Japanese version, which is called Toshinden Subaru, which still feels like the slowest Toshinden of them all, but oh well, you can kill somebody with a pig, so that's pretty cool. This one took a more story-based and team approach to the gameplay, which was a nice change, but overall, each of these Toshinden games is generally fine, but not anything that'll blow you away. Except for the music though, that shit is always incredible. As for the rest of the series, well, the Saturn would eventually see ports of Toshinden 1 and 2, which also kind of made it look bad compared to the PlayStation. There's also a Toshinden Game Boy game, which is actually pretty fun, as well as a Toshinden card battling board game that also made it to the PS1, of course, exclusive to Japan. And there's that time they tried to reboot the series on the Wii with an arena fighter that nobody knows exists, and is also called Toshinden. How exciting. But in between all these other Toshinden games, well, specifically between Toshinden 2 and 3, we got Battle Arena Nitoshinden, which is a light-hearted kids version of Toshinden. Think Virtua Fighter Kids and Pocket Fighter, but you know, Toshinden, and well, you've got the right idea. Now, why did I bother going through all this other stuff before talking about this game? Well, it was a good opportunity to highlight the Toshinden series on the PlayStation, since it is a pretty big part of its history, but more importantly, it meant I didn't have to play this thing, because oh boy, it is weird, and not in a good way. Now first off, it's important to highlight that the Nitoshinden series came from publisher Takara, and was developed by a company called Tamsoft, who some of you might remember as the developers of the first 3 Chorokyu games, which explains why the music in these games are always so good. But Nitoshinden here wasn't developed by Tamsoft, instead it was developed by Viztech Japan, which, if you can believe it, is the same developer and publisher combo behind Crisis City. Seriously, the odds of these two appearing back to back in the wheel is a minor miracle, but this game right here, it is most certainly not a minor miracle. So just to clarify, Nitoshinden features a cast mostly from Toshinden 2, as well as some new characters exclusive to this game, all under a school theme. It kind of explains why the opening to this game is so weird, because it features unused live action footage that was shot for the Toshinden 2 opening, but they kind of just slapped it into this game and then abruptly changed it from this badass opening to yay, happy school time game. It's honestly one of the most bizarre transitions I've ever seen, and when you think about how trolly Viztech was with Crisis City, I wouldn't be surprised if they just thought doing this was kind of funny too, but hey, it is what it is. Now on paper, I'm not against kiddie versions of fighting games. I know there was an argument at the time that they shouldn't really exist as a full price game because, you know, things like Big Head Mode used to exist as cheats, and paying for a whole extra game that's just the same thing with some new arenas and generally worse combat isn't exactly a good idea. I mean, Bloody Roar has a whole kids mode accessible from the options menu, whereas Virtua Fighter Kids is a worse version of Virtua Fighter 2 that you had to pay money for, you know? I mean, who exactly is this for? On the other hand though, you have what Capcom did with Pocket Fighter, which I feel is the optimal way to do a kiddie or chibi fighter, where you effectively make a whole new fighting game that's silly, cute, and aimed at fighting game beginners, while still managing to not dumb down the core gameplay. We still have a good fighting game here, but one that just happens to be a little easier for beginners and newcomers. You know, it's exactly what you'd want, right? Well, Nitoshinden decided to go the Pocket Fighter route because this does not play like any other Toshinden game out there. In fact, it's its own unique thing aimed at fighting game novices. The problem, however, is that this game plays like no other fighting game on the planet. In fact, if you pick this thing up and just tried it out on a whim, there's a chance you might think this is one of the worst fighting games ever made. It really feels that strange to play. So in this game, you have access to a bunch of attacks. X is a low attack, square is a medium or wide attack, triangle is a high attack, and circle is usually some sort of heavy attack. You have access to one special move per character, which is activated by pressing R1, no directional inputs required, and L1 and L2 still roll you in and out of the screen as usual. And if you ever manage to get your health down low, you can also activate a desperation move by pressing R1 and R2 together. Now, you can do this as many times as you like, by the way, and you should never not be doing this once you're on low health, especially if you're playing as the dude that has the giant bonk head attack, or as we call it in Ireland, big Irish head syndrome attack. So the gameplay here seems simple enough, right? But what if I told you these attacks, your lows, your mediums, your highs, these are your only attacks. There's no combo strings, no additional moves tied to directional inputs. Every character has like 6 attacks total. So you know, if you go into the game and are just pressing buttons trying to get your bearings like a regular fighting game, you'll discover that nothing works like a regular fighting game. It just feels so bizarre. Even jumping and ducking is weird in this game. Jumps are mostly fine, but if you attack mid-air, it doesn't unleash an attack, it rather just catapults you straight into the ground. And ducking is a toggle, oddly enough. If you press down, you enter a crouch position, and then you can roll around if you like, which honestly doesn't have that much use. Stranger still, they removed blocking from this game and instead added a parry system tied to the R2 button, which you really are going to have to get down if you want to get anywhere in this thing. It all seems so bizarre to me because the vibe this game gives off is that it's a fighting game for kids that's been simplified so they can learn the ropes, but the issue is that it doesn't play like any other fighting game, and realistically how this game does play is kind of complicated too. Now I'll be honest, if I had picked this up on a whim, I probably would have turned it off after a few minutes because it really does feel that unintuitive, but you know, since it's my moral responsibility to learn and understand the games that I play, I figured why not do that instead, and luckily this game does come with a lovely little video tutorial from this nice lady that explains it all, you know, Clarissa style. Now, a lot of this stuff is the very bare basics of video games. You know, forward moves you forward, back moves you back, up is jump. But importantly, it does teach you how the combat in this game works. So the idea is that instead of bashing buttons and doing inputs, you instead have to time your attacks carefully one after the other. By doing this, you can chain certain attacks into a combo of sorts, I guess you could say. You know, press mid, high, low, strong, strong, high, mid, mid, low, etc. Now these combos do vary from character to character, and you kind of want to figure out what strings work for each, but even still you're only looking at a max of about 3 to 4 hits per combo in this game. But once you do get the hang of it, it kind of makes sense. Use your attacks on enemies, get them stunned, which leaves them open to more attacks. If they try to attack you, you can predict it with dashes and parries, and then they might do the same to you. Also, as you get better, you'll learn that the game really revolves heavily around movement, allowing you to dash pretty wildly around the screen, which is kind of fun. Believe it or not, taking the time to understand this game and its quirks does lead this to being a somewhat enjoyable experience at times, but even then, I still don't think it's very good. When you're playing it as intended, at the best of times, it's still a very bare bones and limited experience, one that severely lacks move variety between its roster of characters, and more importantly, the balance of what is here seems insanely off. Some special attacks are incredibly overpowered and can seemingly loop infinitely, and don't even get me started on the desperation attacks. Once these come into play, there is no stopping the pain, even if they are oftentimes kind of funny. After figuring it all out, I kind of get what they were going for with this thing, and honestly the movement and combo system is quite unique for a game of its type. I mean, if anything, it reminds me the most of Sonic the Fighters if it had like no depth whatsoever, but as a fighting game aimed at beginners, it unfortunately teaches you absolutely nothing about fighting games, and even if you do get good at what this game is trying to do, it's just not very good, I'm sad to say, which is quite the shame because beyond the gameplay, I really enjoyed the presentation of this thing. In fact, I'd even go as far as to say that this is my favourite Nitoshinden game aesthetically. I love the colourful school-inspired levels that bounce along with the little low-poly chibi character designs. I'm not exactly sure why they added bouncy boobs in a kids game, but I guess it does work thematically with the bouncy environments at least, so you know, you can't really complain. The whole thing is honestly very appealing to the eye, and I really like how they adapted some of the Nitoshinden 2 characters into this style. Like, it's great to see characters like Tracy and even the big bad from Nitoshinden Vermilion here in kid form. It legit looks great, especially for a 96 release, and even though it runs at 30 FPS, the game does feel snappy and responsive, so no complaints there. And damn, the music in this thing is also top notch. It may not be Tamsoft behind the wheel this time, but you know Takara isn't letting somebody release a Nitoshinden game without a banger soundtrack. So at the very least, when it comes to the audio-visual experience, Nitoshinden is firing on all cylinders. Anyway, that's a look at Battle Arena Nitoshinden, since all we got is the arcade mode, a versus mode, and that weird video tutorial. And sadly, beating arcade mode doesn't get us any cool FMV cutscenes or unlockables outside of some short text screens, so yeah, that kinda sucks. But the question remains, is Nitoshinden as bad as I originally thought? No, it's not as bad, but it's still pretty bad. It's one of those games where if you don't take the time to understand its gameplay, you're 100% gonna hate it. And if you do take the time to understand its gameplay, you'll probably have a little bit of fun, but even then you could easily play thousands of other better fighting games that are more beginner friendly, enjoyable and intuitive than this thing. Seriously, Pocket Fighter would perfect this whole chibi kids fighting thing a few years later. It is so good. I do respect the developers for trying something new, but as it stands, Nitoshinden is a game only the most hardcore of Toshinden fans should be checking out, and even then, that's probably only out of morbid curiosity or if you like the music and visuals, which, let's be fair, are pretty damn good. Everybody else, however, if you're yet to play any Toshinden game, just check out the main series from the beginning. It's old, but it does play a little better than you probably remember, and it's legit an icon of the PlayStation's early years. Plus, if you work your way up through the series, you get to play as a dude with a chainsaw and a guy who drops pigs on people, which is pretty fun. Okay, and I suppose shout out to the giant bonk head attack in Nitoshinden. Credit where credit is due. That is legit pretty funny.
You will provide.
Well, here we are now with the final game of this volume. It's Brightis, a Sony-published action RPG from 1999, all about darkness and people with no faces. This game was chosen for us today by the lovely Rust Cole, a name that gives me vivid flashbacks to my days as a detective in Louisiana. Oh, what fun we had. Anyway, Brightis here is one of the more noteworthy games we've looked at in this series. I've known about it for quite some time due to the pedigree of the teams behind it, but I've also seen it gain some notoriety more recently due to some similarities with a certain FromSoft series of games, enough so that I've heard Brightis being referred to as Proto-Souls on more than one occasion. And look, I love a good comparison as much as anybody, but I was very much ready to dismiss this as the two games just sharing some visual similarities. But honestly, if you're familiar with the Souls games, there is so much here in Brightis that will immediately remind you of FromSoft that it's kind of hard to ignore. Like, you could clip 100 different images from this game, tell somebody this is a low poly demake of Dark Souls, and they'd probably believe you. It really is uncanny at times. But of course, beyond some similarities to other games, what is Brightis all about? And more importantly, is it any good? Well, let's find out. Now, first off, it's important to highlight the team responsible for this game, or three teams, should I say, them being Sony's first-party Arc Entertainment, who we previously talked about back in Volume 10, when they assisted Into Creates with Love and Destroyed. They also made the Arc the Lad games, which is always easy to remember because it's literally in their name. Although the two teams most responsible for Brightis are Quintet and Shade. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the name Quintet. I feel like if you spent any time learning about the Super Nintendo and its library over the years, games like ActRaiser, Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, and Terranigma will probably have popped up a few times, maybe even Robotrek, if you're really lucky. These guys had some serious pedigree during the 16-bit era, and while many are quite familiar with their works on the Super Nintendo in particular, their next-gen offerings, however, not so much, although I imagine this is mostly down to those games never leaving Japan. There were a couple of games on the Saturn and also a game called Planet Laika, which is about anthropomorphic dogs having a really bad time on Mars. This game got a fan translation a few years back, by the way, and it's something. However, despite Quintet being the biggest name associated with this project, the lead development team seems to be the lesser-known Shade Incorporated, which, from what I can tell, was either a new development team formed within Quintet or a separate team made of ex-Quintet staff. I'm not too sure, but the important thing to note is that Shade Inc. is kind of like Quintet 2 in a way. They were responsible for the PS1 action role-playing game The Grandstream Saga, another collaborative effort with Arc Entertainment released all the way back in '97. A game that both felt like a throwback to the classics, as well as a warm-up for what was to come. And what was to come was Brightis, the team's first attempt at a big, fully 3D, third-person action role-playing game, going beyond their familiar top-down roots to create something more modern and contemporary. It's still a pretty standard fantasy-themed action RPG on the surface. You can expect plenty of combat, dungeons to explore, bosses, villages, item shops, all that good stuff. But now we've got this big 3D world to play around with. And while this may not sound very exciting in and of itself, because, you know, even by 1999, plenty of games have attempted this style, it's the fact that the people making this game had worked on the Heaven and Earth trilogy, the Ys and Xanadu games, and even some people involved in the Story of Thor games, if we've got any Sega fans out there. It's a who's who of Japanese action RPG devs from the 80s and 90s collaborating on a fully 3D Sony-backed video game. It's pretty exciting, you know, or at least I imagine it would have been back in '99. Now, if you're like me and avoided trying this game in the past because you assumed it would be very text-heavy and kind of hard to navigate for a non-Japanese reader, you'll be happy to hear that despite the game featuring quite a lot of story and dialogue between characters, the gameplay portions, which make up the vast majority of the runtime, are very easy to get into thanks to some very intuitive menus and systems, as well as the game just being surprisingly linear and straightforward when you break it all down. There is maybe one or two sections of the game where I felt I would have struggled a little without a guide, but luckily somebody also recently made a GameFAQs guide for this thing that's incredibly useful. So yeah, Brightis has never been easier to get into. Well, Unless you care about the story, that is, which is basically about an evil empire unleashing a bunch of demons across the land. So you gotta go find 4 magic MacGuffins known as the global elements that are hidden in temples and dungeons so you can then seal them away for good. It's something like that anyway, but we'll talk a little bit more about the story later. For now, let's talk about what you do in Brightis, and the answer to that is running around killing slimes, hanging with the boys, exploring cool dark dungeons, and most importantly of all, collecting very, very tiny bags. Once you begin and name your character, you'll begin in a tutorial dungeon, which is probably a big reason why this game can't escape the Dark Souls comparisons. Once you work your way through a few tutorial classics, you'll then visit a nearby town, which acts as the central hub for this game. This is where you'll buy items, upgrade your weapons and armor, learn new combat abilities, and even gain some spooky magic if you're lucky. By the way, don't ever open the chest in the witch's hut, it will come back to bite you. Now, since the goal of this game is to acquire the 4 global elements to defeat the evil demons, we'll need to venture out across this big map to find them. This right here represents the game's overworld, a large mass of connected areas that'll take you anywhere you need to go in this world, and it's pretty big too. Going from one end to the other will probably take you about 15 to 20 minutes, assuming that you can resist smacking a few blobs along the way. However, the world isn't fully open to you from the get-go. In fact, the game follows a pretty linear setup, requiring you to beat each of the game's 7 main dungeons in sequential order, an order that the game is happy to point out to you via some very handy flashing location markers. So as you can see, despite the game's rather large world and potential for navigation woes due to the language barrier, the game's flow is quite literally visit the village, journey to the dungeon, complete the dungeon, return to the village, and then set out for the next dungeon until the game just eventually ends. It's about as straightforward as can be, but the good news is that it's also a lot of fun. Next up, we might as well take a look at the game's movement and combat, since we'll be moving and fighting quite a bit. You'll be happy to hear we have both analog movement and analog camera control, although the default setup has camera rotation mapped to the L1 and R1 buttons, with the right analog stick controlling vertical movement and also a handy zoom function, allowing you quite a lot of freedom in how you want to view this little blue guy. Now, this can be remapped in the options if you like, but since I'm a sucker for shoulder button camera controls, I found the default setup pretty good overall. You've also got a single jump for exploration and platforming, which feels pretty good, and you can hold the L2 button to walk if you're bad at moving over narrow platforms, of which this game has quite a few. Now, combat is where things get a bit more interesting, because while on the surface it's quite simple, Brightis has some pretty fun systems to play around with that make combat satisfying and engaging throughout the game. Now, before you ask, no, there isn't any lock-on system in this game, meaning combat is heavily focused on good positioning and camera control. You've got your little sword to attack enemies, and you've got your little shield to defend against enemies. While you can upgrade your sword and shield throughout the game, these are the only weapons you will be using, so you better get used to them. Now, luckily there's quite a lot that you can do with your mighty sword and shield. Well, not the shield, that is literally only used to block, but the sword, however, lots to play around with. You've got a basic attack tied to the X button by default, which can change depending on your inputs when using it. You've got neutral attacks, forward slashes, jump slashes, and even unique attacks when blocking. There's also a second attack button tied to circle that uses special techniques which you can learn throughout the game by acquiring skill points during combat. You see, back in the village, there's an area with 3 friendly warriors who can teach you new abilities in exchange for skill points. These abilities can be new techniques for the circle button as we mentioned, but there's also upgrades for your regular attacks, as well as a whole bunch of new attacks that can just outright replace those. In fact, you can replace almost every single sword attack in your arsenal with a new type that better suits your playstyle. There's also combo attacks that can be linked together between regular and technique inputs, more directional moves which can get pretty flashy at times, and even some charge moves that are activated by holding down the circle button for the allotted amount of time. There really is quite a lot here, and I was constantly looking forward to getting new and fun abilities to mess around with throughout my playthrough. It's a rather straightforward and intuitive system once you get your head around it. The skill point system needed to unlock these moves, however, a little more complicated. So Brightis does have your standard leveling up system where you get XP by killing enemies. If you level up, you get stronger and tankier, which we love to see. But beyond that, whenever you hit an opponent with your sword in Brightis, you'll get a skill point. Sometimes you'll get more than one skill point, sometimes you'll get lots more, and sometimes you might even lose a skill point because life's not fair. The way this works is that certain moves have different skill point values. Some might reduce it, some might keep it level, and others, if executed correctly, will increase your skill point count by 1. Usually these are special attacks. The idea is that you want to increase the skill number as high as you possibly can using special and combo attacks, because hitting an opponent 3 times with +1 on your meter equals 3 skill points, and doing it 3 times with a +15 meter equals 45 points. And since some of these skills are crazy expensive to buy, the sooner you start playing into this system, the better. Now the catch here is that if at any point you get hit by an enemy, your skill meter is going to reset back down to 1, giving you a great reason to avoid getting hit, you know, besides the whole dying thing. So your incentive for running around like a lunatic in this game is greatly reduced, and your incentive for playing a slow and methodical game of hide behind the shield and exploit your opponent's openings is greatly increased. Now initially, this skill point system is capped to a max of +10, so you don't level up a little too quickly, I suppose, but the good news is that this can be increased by, you guessed it, finding tiny bags around the overworld. See, I told you these would be important. Every time you find a tiny bag, you get a skill coin, which increases your point cap by 1. And with a grand total of 50 skill coins hidden around the world and plenty of juicy skill points to earn, let me tell you, there are few endorphin hits out there like finding a tiny bag in the wild. This is not a drug reference. Now eventually, you do get to mix things up with magic, of which there are 4 spells, all of which are very useful. Fire is great for taking out smaller and flying enemies, Ice for freezing enemies and opening them up to combos, Lightning for quick bursts of damage, and Heal, which fully heals you and removes negative status effects, but at the cost of a full mana bar. By the way, your mana is this little blue ball below your health that fills up automatically over time, but quite slowly. It's only used for your 4 magic spells and this one other item, which we'll get to shortly. Now the slow regen on your MP stops you from relying on magic too much, but something else worth noting is that you don't gain skill points when killing enemies using magic. So fire and lightning are strong options for clearing out a room of enemies, but the trade-off is that you'll get no skill points, whereas something like ice magic, which doesn't do as much damage, is great for splitting up groups of enemies, but also giving you an easy opening for a big sword combo, which means lots of skill points. So as you can see, the combat in Brightis quite easy to get into, but varied and rewarding throughout. Easily one of the highlights of the game, alongside our next section, dungeons, the place where all the action happens, often in the dark. Now dungeons in Brightis are very similar to other 3D action role-playing games, a steady mixture of exploration, combat and puzzle solving, although I'd say puzzles take a backseat to combat and exploration mostly. In fact, almost every puzzle in this game revolves around a shared mechanic, these little blue things called key elements. So in essence, key elements are like keys. You'll need them to activate doors, unlock chests, solve puzzles, and just do about everything and anything depending on what the dungeon requires. Now key elements also tie into what I'd consider the defining feature of Brightis, which is darkness. So every dungeon in this game is dark. Pitch black even, which, to be fair, is probably one of the more accurate video game depictions of lighting in an underground temple. So how do you see, you may ask? Well, the answer to that once again lies in the key elements, which act as your light sources in the dungeon. As long as you're holding one key element in your possession, you can fill up a light meter, which is seen here below your health bar. How full this bar is represents how far you can see ahead of you. Now, this bar does drain automatically over time, but can be filled either by attacking enemies or by standing next to one of the few light sources that are dotted around the dungeon. Finding a new key element also restores your light meter, as does finding a save point, of which there are quite a few dotted around the dungeons and overworlds. Now, early on, dungeons are pretty generous when it comes to light sources, but as the game moves on, the dungeons become much bigger and much less generous. In fact, it's not uncommon to find yourself moving carefully one step at a time, just trying to find your bearings in some of these places, let alone dealing with whatever potential threat lies beyond the shadows. It's a really cool mechanic that rewards quick and aggressive movement throughout the dungeons, but it also adds this really rich and foreboding atmosphere to the environments in-game. Now truthfully, many of the dungeons in this game aren't the most stunning or fantastical to look at up close, but when you mix in the darkness and shadows, it's a vibe that few games can match. Not to mention, it's an incredibly clever way to utilize the console's draw distance limitations and turn it into a mechanic that makes sense in the game world, similar to how Spider-Man on the PS1 was like, yeah man, New York is just full of yellow fog now, that's why you can't see shit. Although I will say, the draw distance in Brightis is really quite poor in situations that don't involve darkness, but we'll talk more about that later. I think the best way to show off the lighting system in Brightis is with this little dart that you get early on in the game that allows you to light up areas in the distance for a small chunk of MP. Not only is this item very useful, but I'd often throw it out into dark areas just to see the effect in action. It's something that I never ever got sick of. By the way, this little thing at the bottom right of your HUD is your quick select screen, which is also pretty damn great. Now this is tied to the triangle button, and holding it down stops time and lets you select from one of 9 different slots, and then once you've selected your item, all you gotta do is tap the triangle button and then you use it. You can put pretty much any item into these slots, but it's very handy for health items, magic, your map, and of course this little light dart thing. It's super easy to use, even during very stressful battles. So now that we know key elements equals progression and light, the rest of the dungeon experience is mostly just exploration and combat. Dungeons are generally quite large, but also flow really well. The level design feels set up to guide you carefully from one place to the next, and you always seem to come across plenty of key elements before you need them, and even when there are a few areas that have branching paths and require some backtracking, it's quite difficult to get lost in this game, I found, even with the darkness in play. Now this certainly isn't the case in some of the later dungeons, which are frankly gigantic, but even there, I somehow never felt lost. I just kept moving forward, checked my map from time to time, made good use of my compass, and well, it always seemed to get me where I needed to go. The real fun with the dungeons I found is how they like to play with verticality and weird shifts in the geometry. Like some dungeons follow a pretty classic template, you know, temples, ruins, castles, that kind of thing, while others just feel like a weird cave that you happen to stumble into. It feels like the designers were making the most of the shift to a full 3D space, and it really stands out as some of the most impressive role-playing game environments on the console in my opinion, even if the actual layouts and designs are quite simple by today's standards. Although one thing that will keep you on your toes throughout is that Brightis can also be very mean to you at times, just for shits and giggles. Many of the dungeons will have enemies in hiding, hidden traps, not so hidden traps, and sometimes hidden enemies sandwiched between a bunch of traps. Usually these aren't too hard to avoid, but a lot of the traps in-game are invisible and need to be uncovered either by looking at them in first-person mode, or just by wandering into them by accident. And I promise you, you will probably discover most of them by walking into them by accident, which is also way funnier. Once you make it to the end of the dungeon, then you get to fight a boss, which usually are quite tough and will definitely put your combat abilities to the test. Bosses often have a pattern or weakness that can be exploited, but as usual it's a case of being patient and figuring this out, or going in all guns blazing and hoping for the best, something which often didn't work out too well for me. There's some nice variety to the bosses in this game, a mixture of big scary monsters and creatures, as well as human opponents who share a very similar moveset to your own, and also sometimes look like you. I wouldn't say they're FromSoft levels of difficult, especially since healing items are quite plentiful in this game, but they can certainly take you out very quickly if you're not prepared. In fact, most enemies in this game can take you out quite quickly if you're not prepared. There's a decent variety across the regular enemies, with many of the fantasy staples making an appearance. You've got slimes, lizard men, a big eye, Bebop and Rocksteady, and my personal favorite, a bunch of mind-boggling skeletons. Skeletons that get increasingly more armed and vicious as the game goes on. Seriously, by the end of the game, they've even got cool dark magic and armor. It means they kill me a whole lot quicker, but at least they look cool. Also, the skeletons laugh at you when they hit you. Yeah, 10 out of 10. Now when you beat a dungeon, if you're lucky you might get one of the 4 global elements. Each one allows you to equip an additional magic attack, and if you're unlucky, you might get nothing, but at least you'll unlock access to the next dungeon, so it's not too bad. Although before you start celebrating, Brightis doesn't teleport you out of a dungeon when you're finished. Instead you need to navigate back out, only now the dungeon is brightened up permanently, so at least that's something. But there's also a benefit to this too. You see, in each dungeon, there's a number of special chests that can only be opened once a dungeon is complete, for the cost of one of your key elements, meaning if you note where the chests are during the dungeon and then return with your leftover key elements, you can get a bunch of rare items and some not so rare items. But seriously, some of the very best items in this game are found inside these chests, including rings that can double your MP regen, and even one that doubles the number of skill points you earn per hit. So memorizing these locations and then marking chests on your map is highly recommended. All this stuff means that by the time you actually get out of the dungeon and use the little home teleporter outside to go back to the village, you feel like you've legit just been on a big ass adventure, all in the space of about 40 minutes. And finally, once you're back, you get to unwind, do your rounds across the village, buy some new weapons and magic with your gold, heal at the inn, talk to your shopkeeper friend, get some new abilities from your pals, and then go out and do it all over again. It's a cycle that I never got tired of, and honestly, playing this game for about an hour each night, doing the whole cycle of journey to dungeon, complete dungeon, return back to village, and buy loads of stuff, it was really some of the most fun I've had playing a game in quite some time. It's admittedly quite linear and straightforward in its design, but the combat, overworld, and dungeons just kept me engaged the whole way through. I found the difficulty scaled really well as you push further into new lands and fight new enemies. You have the ability to unlock shortcuts that can help reduce travel time between the village and some of the dungeons, and you can even find some hidden optional dungeons throughout the lands as well, one of which is hidden in an underground cave called the Clan's Tomb. This is a randomized 10-floor dungeon that tasks you with something different on each floor. You might need to kill all of the enemies or find a specific item to progress, and if you manage to reach the 10th floor, you can find a magic book that unlocks new, more powerful spells from the witch. And let me tell you, if you manage to find the ring that speeds up your MP regen and then combine that with a level 2 heal, your ass ain't dying no more. Believe me. And for waterfall aficionados, there's also a dungeon hidden behind a waterfall in the village, which features another randomized dungeon. Only this one places you in very small rooms with a random assortment of enemies, and there's like 100 floors to get through, or at least I think there is anyway, as I only got to level 63. Sometimes you'll get lucky with what enemies spawn here, and sometimes you will get very unlucky, but it's a nice way to earn some experience and skill points in a pinch, but also to get items and gold, and maybe even some elemental ore, which is used for crafting special elemental blades in the weapon store. See, this game has so much cool shit. I mean, look at this, it even has a pocket station minigame where you can build swords. Isn't that the cutest shit? Brightis is just a really nice game. It feels like a tightly packed bundle of action RPG joy. The kind of game you wish the PlayStation had, only to find out that it had it all along. Of course, the issue is that it's still a PlayStation game after all, and unfortunately I feel like a lot of things that hold this game back are down to it being a PlayStation game. Brightis has some very noticeable draw distance limitations at times, especially when outdoors, and also the performance, while usually sticking to 30 FPS, can frequently drop to the low 20s and high 10s, especially when there's plenty of enemies on screen and in some of the more complex environments. And admittedly, for as much as I enjoy the combat, it's still a little janky in its execution. I think the lack of a lock-on does hurt it in some ways, but it is one of those games where if you adapt to its controls and the rules of its combat, you will have quite a lot of fun with it. Also, I felt that some of the abilities like the charge attacks and the directional inputs really seemed like more effort than they were worth, as in reality, you could probably get through this game quite easily with only a handful of abilities, most of which you will start the game with. But then again, that's the beauty of choice really. What works for me might not work for you, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't pull out the odd complicated move, not for damage or utility, but just because it looks really cool. And let's be fair, that's the most important thing, really. Also, I think there's instances in the latter half of the game where the process of running from the village to the dungeons can drag a little bit, since you're going to be retreading a lot of the same ground that you've ran through before, and the dungeons themselves can also get very stingy with how they divvy out light to the character, often leaving you exploring in darkness for some rather big stretches. Admittedly, it does add to the atmosphere quite a bit, but considering the size of these places, navigation can become quite a pain. Especially in the final dungeon, which is about 2 to 3 times bigger than any other dungeon, and this is the only place where I did legitimately get lost while playing, and let me tell you, this is not the place to get lost in, but hey, it is the final dungeon after all, it might as well be hard. Although in saying that, even with its flaws and technical limitations, there's something really captivating about the way this game looks and sounds that just makes it very, very appealing to me. Like, the game certainly ain't the most impressive with its textures and character models, but there's something very deliberate and thoughtful about almost everything in Brightis, to the point where it's almost kind of classy in a way. Whether it's the faceless characters, the beautiful golden tipped UI, running through a field in the rain, or even just stopping to take in the lovely skyboxes. It's a game that managed to invoke this immense feeling of nostalgia, only it's for a game that I have never played before. I'm not even sure if the feeling is nostalgia. I think it's just that sense of wonderment that these older games can generate. The kind of thing that you felt when you played Ocarina of Time for the first time as a kid, you know, that feeling where you're stepping out into a big 3D world for the first time. Only now, I'm experiencing this in a game that is well over 20 years old, using outdated tech and controls, but the feeling, it still hits the same. When Brightis hits right, on a visual level, it can honestly be one of the most beautiful games on the PlayStation. Now, don't get me wrong, it'll oftentimes show its age, but oftentimes it will remind you that you really can't recreate some of the magic that these low poly games can offer. And on top of that, the music. Oh god, the music. Everything I just said about the visuals, that feeling you get from experiencing them, none of that would be possible without this game's music and sound effects. I mean, when I first heard this game's main menu theme, I was just sitting there thinking, oh shit, we're in for a special one, aren't we? The sound team not only has ex-Quintet guys, but also ex-Falcom staff, as well as the sound director of Gran Turismo and Omega Boost on the Sony side. Quite frankly, the music and sound is just outstanding across the board. If there's one little complaint I could give it, is that the dungeon themes aren't quite as memorable as some of the other tracks, and sometimes the music is a little too upbeat for how tense and scary some of the stuff on screen can be, but in all the places that matter, like the overworld, bosses, villages, and shops, this stuff is going to be stuck in your head long after you beat this thing. It is peak classic RPG goodness. Well, that was a look at Brightis, maybe a longer look than usual for one of these videos, but I figure since it's the end of the episode and there's really not that much stuff about Brightis on YouTube currently, I might as well indulge myself a little bit. But honestly, if any one game deserves the extra time and spotlight, it's this thing. It certainly has its issues and it's sometimes simple to a fault, but damn, I really like this game. If you're looking for a nice bread and butter action RPG that tries a few unique and interesting things with its combat and exploration, Brightis is one of the coziest and most atmospheric that the PlayStation has to offer. It'll take you about 10 to 12 hours to reach the credits, and in my entire playthrough, there were only 2 instances where I ever had to resort to a guide, one being a colour-based puzzle in the first dungeon, and another involving a magic sword that you need to break rocks. Otherwise, this entire game is super easy to get into, and while it certainly has a lot of similarities with the Souls games, Brightis is certainly not a FromSoft game. Sure, it does offer up a decent challenge, its core combat is quite similar, and it oftentimes is a little mean for the fun of it, but Brightis is never as obtuse, unforgiving, or just outright miserable as a FromSoft game. Brightis instead feels more like an honest attempt at bringing those classic top-down action RPGs into a full 3D space, similar to how Nintendo did with Ocarina of Time. Brightis here feels like a glimpse at what something like Soul Blazer could have been in 3D, and let me tell you, it's pretty damn good. As for the story, look, I'll be honest, I didn't really have much of an idea of what was going on during this game. There's enough text present here that if you were to use something like Google Lens to translate it as you go, it would have slowed things down to the point of it hampering the experience, and the only instances where I did resort to Google Lens was to find out what certain items or rings did, and for that, it worked pretty great. Although with that being said, the basic story beats are rather straightforward and quite easy to pick up on as you progress through the game. There's an evil empire doing evil things and you'll often come across and murder like half of their army. There's also lots of main and reoccurring characters, plenty of betrayals, some sacrifices, demon kings, you know, all that classic fantasy banter. Is the game good enough to play while ignoring the story? Personally, I'd say it is, since the gameplay makes up roughly 95% of the total experience, but Brightis is also good enough that it might warrant holding out for a potential fan translation, just so you can have the complete and true Brightis experience. Now, I don't believe there's any translations currently in the works for this game, but I do know that translators are aware of it, and since its stock does seem to be slowly rising over the years, I personally think it's only a matter of time before we do see one. Seriously, we're one low-poly PlayStation Dark Souls article away from this game becoming mainstream, and honestly, whatever helps get these cool old games out to the masses is fine by me, so by all means, clickbait away. As for what happened to Quintet and Shade after Brightis, well, oddly Quintet seemed to just up and disappear not too long after this, with Brightis being one of their final big releases as a studio, not including this Inuyasha PS2 game, which I've not heard great things about. While Shade, on the other hand, seemed to take over the reins from Quintet, with their next big game being the PS2 launch title Orphan Scion of Sorcery, although personally I prefer its much cooler Japanese name, Sorcerer Stabber Orphan, and Shade here, they're still going strong today, most recently working on games like Bullet Girls and Samurai Maiden. Seriously, this game and Brightis share a composer, which is really funny. Anyway, if you're in the mood for a charming, low-poly action RPG adventure that's secretly about the joy of collecting very tiny bags, then you should definitely check out Brightis, one of the true hidden gems of the PS1 library, and a game that does not deserve to be forgotten. Well, there you go, that's another 4 games that never made it out of Japan, unless you happen to own a copy and don't live in Japan, which is quite likely to be fair. Man, maybe the whole name of the show is a lie. We got to play one of the cutest arena battlers around, even if it is full of gunts. A game that might very well be one of the dumbest things ever pressed on a disc. A game where a nice Japanese lady teaches you how to crouch for 5 minutes. And finally, a very dark game with some very bright ideas, and also a hidden waterfall dungeon which we love to see. Possibly the coolest lineup of games we've seen on this series so far. But were they cool enough to make a mark on the dreaded arbitrary ranking system? Were any of the games must-plays? Worth trying if you like the look of them? Maybe just kinda meh? So bad they belong in the trash? Or did I find the game unplayable due to the dreaded language barrier? Well, Volume 15 selection sees Battle Arena Nitoshinden fall into the meh tier, Poppin' Tanks and Crisis City making it into tri tier, and since it sure did brighten up my life, the lovely Brightis gives us another must-play in the Japan-only crown. You love to see it. Nitoshinden, plain and simple, is just kinda weird. What seems like your standard kids version of a popular fighting game series is in fact a strange deconstruction of how a fighting game works, and instead tries to redesign it around simplicity, but to a fault. It's a game that feels really bad and awkward if you try to play it like a regular fighting game, and while I can admit it can be a bit of fun if you take the time to learn its quirks, it's never good enough to really make it worth the investment. Well, unless you really like Battle Arena Toshinden and cool, bouncy, low-poly characters and banging music, I suppose. Although one benefit is that it will make you like the other Toshinden games more, and also remind you of better school-themed fighting games as well, so that's pretty nice. As for Poppin' Tanks, this is a very fun, very cute, and surprisingly fleshed out vehicular arena battler with tons of single player content to keep you busy thanks to the wonderful Tank World mode. Unfortunately, it didn't hook me in for as long as I would have hoped thanks to some lopsided weapon balance and the repetitive nature of progression, but really on the whole, this is a game you can't go wrong with, especially in a competitive setting, so go on, give it a try, you'll be serving Gunt in no time. Ah yes, now time for Crisis City, my beloved. You are the fire in my heart. The big dumb fire caused by a multiple vehicle pileup and subsequent explosion. I'll say it before and I'll say it again. This is mechanically and content-wise a pretty average game that is completely bolstered by how fucking insane it is. I mean, it's janky, it's poorly balanced, it often doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I love it so much. It's just a game that's really excited to be a video game, you know? And as long as you go in looking for a good time and not a masterpiece, there's few games out there as funny and fun as Crisis City. Also, seriously, do check out City Crisis. That really is pretty good. And finally, we have Brightis, a game that I was initially worried would end up in the no gaijin section. Seriously, I still get flashbacks to getting stuck in blade arts after wandering in a cave for 2 hours. But to my surprise, not only was Brightis very easy to get through for a non-Japanese reader, it's just a damn good video game in general. It just gives you this cozy, warm feeling of exploring a big world in the early days of 3D gaming with lovely views, friendly villages, and joyful music, all tied in with fiendish traps, evil demons, dark dungeons, and spooky skeletons who laugh at you. Sure, it could have better performance, its visuals and draw distance could be nicer, and yeah, the dungeon design and exploration does get a little bit repetitive by the end, but the parts this game does well, it does very well. The combat and light gimmicks alone are probably enough to win most people over, but what I really loved about it was how much it felt like a pure classic action role-playing game, just blown up into 3D. And while I wouldn't say it reaches the lofty heights of a 3D Zelda game, or even a Dark Souls I guess, Brightis did give me an overwhelming feeling of joy multiple times when playing through it, a feeling that only really special games can invoke. Maybe it's down to the way it looks, maybe it's down to the way it sounds, or maybe it's because it's really fun to collect little tiny bags, but either way, it's a game that I can't recommend enough. I'd still say it's probably worth holding out for a fan translation just so you can experience it at its very best, but if you really can't wait, just go right ahead. Don't let a little Japanese text stop you. Now before we finish up, we've of course got to give a big shout out to the wheels chosen for this episode. So give it up for the trio of Clear Mountain, Ryuma King, and Shawnee for Poppin' Tanks, Gabriel Lucas for Crisis City, SM Kierstead for Battle Arena Nitoshinden, and finally, Louisiana's finest, Russ Cole for picking Brightis. Thank you all so much for your contributions, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. And of course, we've got to give a big shout out to the lovely supporters on patreon.com for making videos like this possible, including fine folks like Alan Caslin, Bloody Cassie, Callow Mellow, Danny, Dave Nolan, Discun, the mascot for the Famicom Disc System, Doma, Fergal O'Hagan, Gamer Squirt, Gerard Winter, Globe99, Howie, Icelight, Kyle Winter, Life Sword, Mr. Papala, Moomin Biscuit, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, Mr. the Joshmon, Nathan McMullen, Nick Norman, Richard Kramer, SN Kierstead, Spectre117, and Tokoto, who have all subscribed at the Fan++ tier. And finally, last but not least, a big thank you to you at home or wherever you are for watching this video. Normally, this is where I'd say I'd be back real soon with some more PS1 content, but I'm gonna go into hibernation for a little while to work on a big video, so maybe I won't see you real soon, but when you do see me, oh baby, it's gonna be good. So until then, take it easy, look after yourselves, and I'll see ya when I see ya. See ya.